Save the date for .NET Conf 2019, September 23rd through 25th. .NET Conf is a free 3-day virtual developer event co-organized by the .NET community and Microsoft. This year, .NET Core 3.0 launches at .NET Conf, so you don't want to miss this. Over the course of the 3 days, you have a wide selection of live sessions that feature speakers from both the .NET product teams and the community. You will have a chance to learn, ask questions live, and get inspired for your next software project. We'll have presentations on .NET Core and ASP.NET Core, C#, F#, Azure, Visual Studio, Xamarin, and much more. Head to www.dotnetconf.net. That's .NETconf.net to learn more and tune in.
In this episode of the On.NET Show, we're going to learn all about creating custom bindings for Azure Functions with my good buddy Matías. Make sure you check it out. Welcome to another episode of the On.NET Show. My name is Celso Philip, and with me, I have Matías. How are you doing, Matías?
Pretty good. Thanks for the invite. It's a pleasure to be here.
So for our folks that are watching, why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are and what exactly it is that you do?
I'm a software engineer in the Azure Cosmos DB team, but I also work with the Functions team in the Azure Cosmos DB bindings.
Gotcha. Okay. So Azure Functions happens to be probably one of my most favorite services in Azure. Like I use it all the time. I'm particularly a fan of like triggers and bindings, right? To do a lot of cool stuff. I think what you're going to talk to us about today is how we can create custom bindings with Azure Functions.
Exactly. The idea of today's show is to actually help any developer that wants to create their own custom binding. That might sound like a really complex thing, but if we take a look at it and see the details, it's going to be really easy.
Yeah.
So what I did is, I'm sure you're familiar with the Azure Cosmos DB bindings.
Right.
They use the Cosmos DB B2 SDK, and we're releasing the new B3 SDK. So what I did is I created from scratch a new Azure Functions binding using the B3 SDK in order to understand what are the key components that any developer should be implementing in order to create a new binding for whatever scenario they want to use.
Right. So right now we have a bunch of we have our own bindings that we provide.
Yep.
So Cosmos DB is one, Azure Service Bus, different types of bindings. So what you're going to show us now is not just how we could use these bindings, but you're going to show us specifically how we could create our own ones that could target, whatever our particular data source might be.
Exactly. So by creating a binding from scratch, what I tried to do is I took these base and minimum components, and then I grouped them into 5 steps. So the idea is to show you a GitHub repo that any developer right now can clone, and going from step 1 to step 5, they will be able to create their own custom binding for their own custom scenario.
What I love about this is that because you have this repo, after folks have watched this video, they could go and check out the repo and they could follow the instructions and they could create your same binding, or you can create their own.
Exactly. So basically the repo has 5 projects, one for each step. Okay. And each step, except obviously the first one, references the previous one. Yeah. So when you are customizing each step, then the binding at the end on step 5 will be completed, and you will be able to use that binding in your own Azure Functions project.
Awesome.
So the idea is to start with step 1. In step 1, what we need to do is define our attribute. The attribute is the way that we expose any configuration or setting that we want the end user to be able to set in our binding.
Yeah. So with Azure Functions today, what I'm used to doing is I'll put an attribute next to a parameter of some sort.
Exactly.
And then inside of that attribute, like let's say it's again like the Cosmos DB attribute, I might give it the connection string or the name of the collection or something like that.
Exactly. In this case, what I'm doing is I define this Cosmos DB attribute, and then I just have a bunch of properties, for example, the database name, the container name, the connection string, and there are a couple of interesting decorators that we can add to our custom bindings. The auto-resolve one will make it so if the user uses one of the binding patterns, that's kind of like using the percentage. The auto-resolve will make it so when the functions runtime picks up our custom binding, it will try to look in the settings, in the environment settings or in the settings file, and will automatically replace whatever the user set in that placeholder with the real value in the environment.
Oh, awesome. And we don't have to really write any code. We just have to put that attribute in it?
Exactly. You just add the auto-resolve decorator to whatever attribute in your binding that you want to resolve automatically, and it will do it magically for you.
That's awesome.
And there is another one called connection string. It works similarly, but it also looks for in the connection string settings in your function app.
Got it.
But the idea is that it works seamlessly. So basically, this is all what you need to do in your first step. You need to think what are the configuration settings or the options that you want your end user to use for your binding, and that's it. Right. Now, if we go to step two will have what we call our collector factory or our service factory. The idea in step 2 is we want our binding to connect to some service. In this case, I want the binding to connect to the Cosmos DB database. But it could be a web API, it could be any other Azure service.
Yeah.
So the idea of step 2 is you need to create this factory that will create instances of whatever client you want to provide to your end users.
Sure.
In this case, it's taking some of the attributes that I defined in step 1, for example, the connection string and the current region, and then internally it's just creating an instance of the Cosmos DB v3 client.
Got it.
And then the other thing that we need to do is we need to expose an interface. We'll see why we need to expose an interface in step 5, but we also need to do that in step 2.
Okay.
Then if we go to step 3, the idea is in this step is to actually create what the binding will do when it's invoked. So I have my attribute that define in this case the connection string and the database. Yeah. I have my client or the client that my binding will create. And in step 3, what I do is I create the collector which takes whatever the user wants to save in my database.
Sure.
It uses the client that I'm providing with the attributes that the user set and does something. Like whatever I want to do. In this case, I want to save the item that the user is passing to the collection or container in the Cosmos DB account. But if I'm implementing my own custom binding for example, sending data to my web API, this is the point where I will take the HTTP client, take the data from the user, and then send the payload.
Right.
The Azure Functions bindings provide a couple of very generic interfaces that we can implement. In this case, I'm implementing the async collector that is mostly used in output bindings. But you could create your own things here. You could expose a custom class. You could expose a custom interface. There is no real limitation. I'm just using the async collector because it's kind of like a common interface for people using output bindings.
Sure.
Then the other thing that I do in step 3 is I create a binding context. So basically, and we'll see in the last step how everything comes together. What I have in the context is the value of the current attribute and the client that the factory in step 2 is passing me. And this is the context that I will be using in my collector, right? I will be receiving the context and using that information. For example, I'm using, in this case, a Boolean that will tell me if the user wants me to create the collection for them or not. And then I'm using part of the information in the context to save the document in the database.
Got it.
And then step 4 is what I call the glue that binds everything together. So in step 4, what we define is actually an implementation of this iExtension config provider interface. The iExtension config provider interface has only one method called initialize. And this is where we kind of like make the magic happen. We create what we define as rules, and each rule will tell which is the type of attribute that we want it to wire. We can add some validators. The validators will make it so. Let's quickly show what this guy does. It's actually validating that one of the parameters is there because we really need the connection string, for example. If we are doing our own custom binding, this is the point where we can add validations for any required parameter that we give the user the possibility to have, but they might have a null value or a value that we cannot support.
And this is something that you have to implement yourself, right? Like, so you have your specific validation rules
exactly
for your attribute,
exactly
for your output binding or input binding,
exactly,
and then you implement that.
It's an optional step when you define the rule because you don't really need to add the validation.
Sure.
But if you want, you can define it, calling this add validator method in the rule.
Sure.
And finally, what I do is I call this bind to collector method. And I pass in an open type. This open type is, let me quickly show you. So basically, what we can do is we can filter which types, which C# types or custom classes we allow our
attribute to work with.
Exactly.
Got it.
There is a base one called opentype.poco. But we can inherit from that one and add our own custom validations. In this case, I don't want users to be able to pass an enumerable.
Yeah.
But if you don't have any kind of filtering, you could just use the OpenType POCO implementation.
Okay. Got it.
And then going back to my bind to collector. So the bind to collector will say, hey, expose this Cosmos DB attribute and give the user an async collector, but in order to do it, use this converter. Now the converter in step 4, what it takes is, it takes an attribute and it creates a context. So the context we were using in the previous steps,
right.
It creates one based on the value of our current attribute, and when it creates it, it's also getting an instance of a service. So let me go back a couple of steps.
Okay, so that get service, is that like a DI thing that's going on there? Or
no, right now it's just a custom implementation.
Okay.
And what I do is I create kind of like an internal cache,
okay,
to avoid having multiple instances of my Cosmos DB client.
Right.
Because in the case of Cosmos DB, we want to, following the best practices, have one client instance
right.
per connection string.
And that's because to create the instance is relatively expensive.
Exactly.
Because you have to open sockets and things of that
exactly.
nature. And so from a resource management perspective, we want to make sure that we efficiently handle
it. And this applies to other type of clients like the HTTP client. So if you're connected to the web API, you might want to have your own custom cache of these clients instead of creating one in every execution.
Sure.
So basically, the create context will get a service instance either from the cache or it will create one, and then return this context to the collector. And finally, let me just go back here. And finally, what we do is this convert will just create one async collector instance, passing the context we just resolved. This is kind of like where the magic happens, because we are just taking one attribute. We are creating the context. We are creating a client if we really need to, or picking up one from our internal cache, and then creating this implementation of the collector that we saw in the previous step. This is the collector that will get exposed to the end user, and whenever they call add item, this is the guy that will do the work for them.
Awesome.
And the final step, that it's kind of like it's really small, but you really need it to. You need an implementation of the iWebShops startup. So basically, this makes it so when the user is referencing the custom binding, this iWebShops startup implementation will just hook into the initialization pipeline of the function extension and call a method. This method, in this case, is adding my extension, my implementation of the config provider.
Sure.
And then I'm using this, using DI to have one instance of the original collector factory that I had in step 2. So this is, there isn't really more than this. It's just having a config provider, wiring up the converter with the attribute, having a context, and just having this extension so the user doesn't have to do anything other than referencing the package,
or whatever the case is.
Either a NuGet package or a project. That's kind of like the whole deal. And finally, what I have to share with you is I have a sample. This code sample shows you, it's actually in the repo, so they can even use it.
Yeah, but you're showing us exactly how to use it now, right?
Exactly. So what I did is, this is the Cosmos DB attribute that I defined in step 1. This is using this auto-resolve properties that is picking up from my local settings JSON file.
Yep.
And here is the async collector implementation. So I'm getting this async collector instance inside my functions log, so my functions code, and I'm just calling this add async method. That if we remember from step 3, it's just pumping that data into the database.
Right.
And if I press F5, I want to show you how each of the steps comes into play when the functions runtime starts with my custom binding implementation. So we'll wait a couple of seconds. You can see in the logs that it's compiling each step individually, and each step references the previous one.
Right. Okay, that's interesting.
And then the host will
now
start.
It's going to spin up the function host.
Exactly.
So I'm guessing because you did that iWebJobs startup, now the host is going to wire up. There you go. So
exactly.
Now the host is going to wire
up
this thing.
Exactly. The first thing that happens is that it wires up and it fires my add Cosmos BB3 implementation. That it's actually adding the extension and adding the collector factory. So this small sample will fire every 30 seconds. This is how it's initializing the context from step 4. It's defining the binding rule and defining the binding collector. And when I press F5, it will fire the first time. So when it fires the first time, it gets a context. This context will, in this case, get a service. And because I don't have anything in my cache,
it will create one.
It will create one and add it to the cache. This is where I'm calling create client in my collector factory. And I'm just taking data from the attribute, in this case, the account endpoint, and just creating the client. And then the functions code will call add async. And here's how my collector implementation gets called, receives the item from the user, and then eventually calls upsert document and stores it in the database.
Right. And so from the user perspective, or from the developer perspective anyway, so we got an instance of async collector.
Yep.
But now what we just saw is that, because you created your own and you wired up an extension,
yep.
Right? Like we were able to, essentially, we're using your version
my
of
version
that.
of, yeah, exactly.
Right.
And this is another function trigger. So every time the function trigger, the converter will get called. It will try to build a context. But in this case, since I already have a Cosmos client instance,
right.
It will just use the one that I have in the cache.
Right.
It will give the context to the collector implementation, and the add async method gets called again, and then I get another upsert invocation, and then so on and so forth. So for every invocation, the converter creates the context and passes down the context to the collector, so the user can call the add async method or add async implementation. It's kind of, it's not really hard once you understand the basics. Sure. and the basic components that you require. And the idea is that, like you said, any developer can now fork this repo, clone it, and then start from step 1 and implement their own attribute and their own collectors and everything.
Right, kind of like what we were talking about a little while ago. I think it would be interesting to have one for the Redis service.
Yep.
For doing caching, right? Because there's not one today. So, maybe that might be something that one of you might want to try out, is to create an implementation using Redis and create a custom input or output binding.
Right. It's really easy once you understand the basic components. And then you can start taking those basic components and build on top of them.
Right. I know this is also running on Functions v2. And I know the other day we released dependency injection support there too. So I'm guessing that means that all of your classes, all of your components can be involved in that
exactly
in that DI space, and I can pull on a logger or app insights or whatever the case is, and use it inside of
exactly. Basically, if we take a look at step 5, I'm using part of the DI to add a singleton instance of the collector factory. So you could even define your own, like you mentioned. Your own components that use DI, and then reuse them across the function extension implementation.
Great, awesome. Well, this is great, man. So tell me now, so after I've watched this video, where can I go exactly to learn a little bit more about this? Is the repo already online and published?
Yeah, actually,
check it out?
let me zoom in. All right. So here's the URL.
You can just show us the URL. So this is on your GitHub repo.
Yep.
right?
You can just fork it, and if we check the repo, here are all the 5 steps. And if you go to each step and you click on that, you will have a README explaining what are which this step actually does, and what are the actions for each step. So basically, once you clone the repo, you go to each step, you do whatever it's in the actions on this step, and you will eventually come to a step 5 with your custom functions implementation.
Yeah, this is like a great little mini workshop. So again, like I could kind of just go in here and go through the steps and create my own version of, again, whatever my input or output binding happens to be.
Yep, and each step will kind of explain the same thing that I mentioned before. For example, step 4 explains how the extension config provider works, and have some kind of snippets that point to the source files, and you still have the actions in this step.
Great, we'll just make sure that we have this inside of the show notes so that everybody that's watching can check it out.
Awesome.
All right, well, thank you so much for coming on, man. I really appreciate it.
It's been my pleasure.
And thank you all for watching. This has been another episode of the On.NET Show, and we learned all about creating custom bindings for Azure Functions.